The Estonia left Tallinn at 7:15 in the evening on September 27, 1994. A floating palace, 509 feet of steel, 8 decks, 400 cabins, a ballroom with chandeliers, a sauna, a casino, duty-free shops stocked with perfume and liquor. She had cost over $200 million to build, and millions more each year just to keep her running. She was the pride of a newly independent nation. Modern, certified, safe, a routine overnight crossing to Stockholm. 989 people on board, families, honeymooners, border guards, a famous singer. Truck drivers carrying cargo no one would talk about. By 1:30 the following morning, she was gone. The official story was clear. The alternative explanations were not. Decades later, new evidence surfaced that wasn't in the original report. Evidence that governments tried to bury under international treaty. This is the dark story of Estonia's most controversial cruise, MS Estonia. We're going to cover everything. The ship's hidden history. The passengers who should never have been there. The 40 minutes that changed maritime law forever. And the sealed wreck that may hold answers we're not allowed to find. Everyone was present. Everything was logged. So why do the timelines not align? Why was the wreck declared untouchable? And what were they really carrying that night? The ship could carry 989 people when fully loaded. That night, she did. 803 passengers, 186 crew. Estonians, Swedes, Finns, Germans, British. Truck drivers and honeymooners. Border guards and rock musicians. A cross-section of the Baltic world, all of them moving westward through the dark. The route was simple, Tallinn to Stockholm. 15 hours, more or less. It was a journey the Estonia made several times a week. A routine so familiar that passengers treated it less like travel and more like a floating hotel. You boarded in the evening, had dinner, perhaps a drink, then went to bed. By morning you were in Sweden. Clean, efficient, comfortable. The kind of transit that lets you forget you are at sea. But the sea does not forget you. On the night of September 27th, the weather was already turning. Force 7 winds, gusting to force 8. The Baltic in autumn is not forgiving. Waves built to 4 meters, sometimes 5. The Estonia had stabilizers, modern navigation equipment, a hull designed to handle rough seas. She had been refitted recently, inspected, certified, every regulation met, every checkbox ticked. And yet, the ship carried a flaw that no one had noticed. Or, perhaps, no one had wanted to notice. A flaw in the bow visor, the massive steel door at the front of the ship that opened to let vehicles drive onto the car deck. 55 tons of hinged metal, held in place by locks that were, according to later investigations, not quite strong enough for the forces they would face that night. The passengers did not know this. How could they? They boarded in Tallinn, under a grey sky, wheeling suitcases across the gangway, chatting in Swedish and Estonian and Finnish. Some were returning home from business trips. Others were starting vacations. There were families with children. There were elderly couples. There was a choir, 20 members strong, heading to a performance in Sweden. Out of those 20, only a handful would survive. But at 7:15 in the evening, they were still laughing, still rehearsing harmonies in the corridors, still alive. Among the passengers was Pierre Isaksson, a Swedish singer who had been famous in the 70s. His voice was deep, rich, the kind that filled a room even when he spoke. That night, he was hosting a karaoke event in the pub, singing with passengers, taking requests, making people smile. He would die before dawn. But in those final hours, he gave them music. There was Urmas Alender, an Estonian rock musician, traveling home. A man whose voice had defined a generation in Estonia, whose songs had been sung in bars and living rooms across the country. He too would not see morning. There were also more private tragedies in the making, Families whose names you will not know. A mother and daughter sharing a cabin. A young couple on their honeymoon. An off-duty ship captain who survived the sinking but whose story became folklore, tangled in conspiracy theories and unanswered questions. The Estonia carried them all westward, through the dark, through the rising waves, toward a disaster that was already forming in the bow of the ship, in the metal that was beginning to crack, in the locks that were beginning to fail. Life aboard was convivial, despite the rough seas. The ship pitched and rolled, enough to make some passengers queasy, but nothing alarming. Nothing that suggested catastrophe. In the grand ballroom, people danced. In the restaurants, waiters served Scandinavian fare, smoked salmon and potatoes, dark bread and butter. In the duty-free shop, bottles clinked gently as the ship moved. In the cabins, passengers settled in for the night, pulling curtains closed, setting alarms for early breakfast, unaware that they would never wake. By midnight, most were asleep. A few hundred remained in the lounges, in the pub, watching Isaacson sing, or wandering the corridors, restless from the motion of the ship. The crew carried out their routines. The kitchen cleaned up. The night shift prepared for the early breakfast service that would never happen. On the bridge, officers monitored the weather, watching the waves build, but nothing beyond what the Estonia had handled before. She was a modern vessel. She was safe, or so everyone believed. And then, shortly after 1 a.m, the banging began. It was not loud at first. A metallic thud, deep in the bow, felt more than heard. Some passengers later said they thought it was cargo shifting. Others thought it was waves hitting the hull. On the bridge, an indicator light may have flickered, showing something amiss with the bow door, but it was brief, easy to dismiss. The ship had sailed in rough seas before. The bow visor had always held, until it didn't. At approximately 1:15, the 55-ton bow visor tore off, not opened, tore. The locks failed under the relentless pounding of the waves, and the entire front-loading door, the visor that covered the car ramp, ripped away from the ship and sank into the Baltic. Behind it, the inner ramp door, which should have been a secondary barrier, was not designed to hold back the sea on its own. It bent, it opened, and the water came in. The car deck of the Estonia was vast, an open space, 200 meters long, filled with trucks and cars and cargo. No watertight compartments, no bulkheads to slow the flood. Just one enormous room, and suddenly, the Baltic Sea was pouring into it at a rate of thousands of liters per second. The ship began to list. 15 degrees to starboard, then 30, then more. Below, in the cabins, passengers woke to a world tilted sideways. Furniture slid, suitcases tumbled. People were thrown from their bunks, landing against walls that had become floors. The ship's main engines, losing lubrication as the tilt worsened, shut down. The lights went out. Emergency lights flickered on, dim and yellow, casting long shadows in corridors that were now slanted at impossible angles. At 1:22 in the morning, the bridge sent out a mayday call, but it was weak, confused. The officer on duty said, "Good morning, we have a problem." An almost conversational tone, as if asking for directions. A nearby ferry, the Mariella, heard it and assumed it was a pan-pan, an urgent call, but not a distress. It took several minutes, several repetitions, before the full scope of the disaster became clear. By then, the Estonia was already past saving. Inside the ship, chaos. Passengers climbed upward, towards the port side, the high side, clawing at walls, at railings, at anything that would hold them. Doors that had been vertical were now horizontal. Stairwells became shafts. Water rushed in from below, cold and black, filling corridors, drowning those who could not move fast enough. The public address system managed one brief announcement. "Alarm, alarm, there is a problem with the ship," in Estonian, then in English, and then it cut out. The ship had no time to evacuate properly. Lifeboats on the port side dangled uselessly in the air, unreachable. Lifeboats on the starboard side were already underwater. A few inflatable life rafts deployed automatically as the ship sank, but most passengers never reached them. They were trapped inside, in cabins and corridors that had become prisons. Or they made it to the outer decks, only to find themselves clinging to railings on a ship that was now lying on its side, half submerged, sinking fast. By 1:30, the Estonia was at a 60-degree list. By 1:50, she was gone. Stern first, she slipped beneath the surface, her bow briefly pointing skyward, and then nothing. Just debris, life rafts, bodies, and the sound of the wind. The rescue operation that followed was one of the largest in Baltic history. The Finnish Maritime Rescue Coordination Center in Turku took command at 2:30 in the morning and dispatched every available helicopter from Finland and Sweden. 26 helicopters in total, military and civilian, converging on a patch of dark sea where the Estonia had been. The first helicopter arrived at 3:05, about an hour after the sinking. Pilots performed daring maneuvers, hovering in high winds, winching survivors from life rafts, from the water, from the overturned bottom of a half-inflated raft where people clung like shipwrecked sailors from another century. 5 nearby ships joined the surface search. The Mariella, the Silja Europa, the Isabella, the Birka Princess, a cargo vessel whose crew had no training for this but came anyway. They directed searchlights across the waves, looking for the flashing lights of life rafts, the pale faces of survivors bobbing in the water. Some survivors were pulled aboard using evacuation slides. Others were winched up by helicopters, shivering, hypothermic, barely conscious. The water temperature was 10 degrees Celsius, cold enough to kill in less than an hour without proper protection. And none of the passengers had immersion suits. Few had even managed to grab life jackets. Some survivors later said they found life jackets floating in the water after they had already escaped the ship, and put them on only then, treading water in the dark, waiting for a helicopter that might never come. By morning light, the sea was littered with debris, empty life rafts, suitcases, clothing, bodies. The focused search was called off at 7 in the morning. Anyone still alive after 6 hours in that water would have been a miracle, and miracles that night were in short supply. 137 people survived. One of them died later in the hospital, bringing the final count to 136. 852 died. Most of them are still inside the wreck, resting at 80 meters depth, in a ship that was later declared a marine grave by international treaty. Their families would never get their bodies back, never hold a funeral, never have closure. The numbers tell part of the story, but only part. 111 men survived, 26 women, no children under 12. The physical challenge of escaping a capsizing ship in a storm, combined with the brutal cold of the Baltic, meant that survival favored the young, the strong, the fortunate. Whole families perished. An Estonian family of 4, only the father's body was recovered. A Swedish couple on their honeymoon, both lost. The choir scattered across the sea floor. Estonia lost roughly 1 person per 1,000 of its population that night. For a young nation, barely 3 years independent, it was a wound that would not heal. In Sweden, it was the second deadliest peacetime maritime disaster in the nation's history. In Finland, though fewer Finns were aboard, the rescue effort left a mark. Helicopter pilots who saved lives that night still do not speak easily about what they saw. The investigations began almost immediately. A joint Estonian-Finnish-Swedish commission, formed within days, tasked with answering a single question. Why? How does a modern ferry, certified and inspected, sink in 40 minutes in conditions it was designed to handle? The answer, when it came in 1997, was simple. The bow visor locks failed. Storm stress tore the visor off. The car deck flooded. The ship capsized. Design flaws, oversight failures, and bad luck combined into catastrophe. But not everyone accepted that answer. Alternative theories emerged, whispers of a collision with a submarine, claims of secret military cargo, reports of an explosion. In 2005, and again in 2020, independent investigations and documentaries claimed to have found evidence of a hole in the hull, evidence that suggested something other than visor failure. The Swedish government reopened limited inquiries, but as of now, the official cause remains. The bow visor failed, and the Estonia sank. What is certain is that the disaster changed everything. Within a year, every ferry with a bow visor in Europe was modified. Secondary locking mechanisms installed. Wave deflectors added. Indicators on the bridge to monitor door integrity. The regulations that the Estonia had technically met were rewritten. Stability requirements for ro-ro ferries, the kind with large open car decks, were overhauled. Voyage data recorders, the maritime equivalent of black boxes, became mandatory. The Estonia had no black box. Everything had to be reconstructed from survivor testimony, from scattered instrument readings, from the wreck itself. And the wreck remains, even now, at the bottom of the Baltic, sealed by treaty. Forbidden. A grave for 852 people, most of whom were never recovered. In Tallinn, a memorial stands by the sea, a broken arch listing the names of the dead. In Stockholm, a granite walkway split in two, symbolizing lives cut short. Every year on September 28th, memorial services are held. Flowers are laid. Survivors gather, fewer each year, bound by a tragedy they did not ask for and cannot forget. The Estonia is not just a shipwreck. It is a scar, a lesson, a mystery that refuses to close. And it is a reminder that the sea, no matter how familiar, no matter how routine the crossing, does not owe us safe passage. We travel on her sufferance. And when she decides otherwise, we have 40 minutes if we are lucky. 40 minutes to escape. 40 minutes to survive. 40 minutes between a floating palace and a tomb. The Estonia did not sink because of one failure. She sank because of many. A lock that was not strong enough. A design that was not robust enough. A crew that reacted too late. A system that did not account for the unthinkable. And perhaps, though we will never know for certain, something else. Something that left a hole in the hull. Something that the official reports did not fully explain. Something that lives now only in the testimony of divers who violated the treaty and the documentaries that keep asking questions. But the sea keeps her secrets. And the Estonia, resting in the dark, keeps hers. The Estonia's crew numbered 186. Mostly Estonians, some Swedes, a few Finns. They ranged from seasoned officers who had sailed for decades to young stewards working their first season. Captain Arvo Andresson was 44 years old, an experienced mariner who had commanded vessels in Soviet times and now helmed what was supposed to be the pride of the new Estonian merchant fleet. He went down with his ship. What exactly he did in those final minutes remains unclear. Survivors say they saw him on the bridge, giving orders. But the bridge itself was in chaos, tilting, losing power, the instruments failing one by one. The chief officer, the staff captain, the engineers, most of them died. Some tried to launch lifeboats. Some tried to maintain power. Some, according to scattered accounts, simply stood at their posts as the ship rolled, knowing there was nothing left to do. The crew's response has been scrutinized endlessly. Why was the alarm delayed? Why was the distress call so weak, so uncertain? Why did no one sound a clear, immediate evacuation order? The answer most likely is that they did not know. Not at first. The bow visor tearing off was not something that registered clearly on the bridge. The indicator lights were ambiguous. The sensors were designed to show if the visor was open, not if it had been ripped away entirely. By the time the crew understood the scope of the disaster, the ship was already listing too severely to mount an organized evacuation. The lifeboats could not be launched. The corridors were impassable. The passengers were on their own. And yet, there were acts of heroism. Margus Mennick, an engineer, crawled through a flooding compartment to manually start an emergency generator. The lights came back on, briefly, giving passengers a few precious minutes of visibility. He did not make it out. Junior Second Officer Andres Tames stayed at his post, sending mayday calls, helping to launch a life raft, and then vanished. Some crew members threw life jackets to passengers. Others guided people toward exits. But the overwhelming impression, from survivor testimony, is of a crew that was as overwhelmed as the passengers, that had no time to coordinate, no chance to lead, no ability to save the ship or the people on it. The Estonia was operated by Estline, a company jointly owned by Estonian and Swedish interests. For Estonia, the ship was more than a ferry. It was a symbol. 3 years after independence from the Soviet Union, the Estonia represented connection to the West, economic opportunity, modernity. The crew took pride in that. They were not just ferry workers. They were ambassadors of a new nation, but that pride could not save them when the bow visor failed. National symbols sink just as quickly as any other ship. The ownership and maintenance of the Estonia have been examined in forensic detail. The ship had been refitted in 1993. She had been inspected. She had passed every required certification. The Classification Society, Bureau Veritas, had signed off on her seaworthiness. And yet, the bow visor had cracks, hairline fractures in the locking mechanism, evidence of metal fatigue. Whether these cracks were visible during inspections, whether they were reported and ignored, whether they were simply missed, this remains contested. What is certain is that the visor was under-designed for the forces it would face. The locks were not strong enough, the hinges were not robust enough, and no one, apparently, thought to install a backup system, a secondary barrier, a fail-safe. In hindsight, it seems obvious, but hindsight is cheap. In 1994, the Estonia was considered safe. She was modern. She was certified. She was routine. The first clear sign that something was catastrophically wrong came at 1:15 in the morning. The metallic banging that had started earlier, the thuds that passengers had dismissed as waves or shifting cargo, suddenly became something else. A violent tearing sound, a shudder that ran through the entire ship. And then, almost immediately, the list. 15 degrees to starboard. Enough to make walking difficult. Enough to send objects sliding across floors. But not yet enough to cause panic. Some passengers, woken by the motion, assumed the ship had made a sharp turn. Others thought it was a larger wave. On the bridge, officers stared at instruments that were beginning to give impossible readings. The ship was tilting, and tilting fast. By 1:20, the list was 30 degrees. Furniture overturned. Passengers in lower cabins found themselves scrambling uphill, toward doors that were now above them. Water was already in the corridors on the starboard side, cold and black, rising steadily. The car deck, invisible to passengers, was flooding at a catastrophic rate. Trucks and cars broke loose, crashing into bulkheads, into each other, adding to the chaos. The free surface effect, the way water shifts inside a hull, was accelerating the capsize. The Estonia was not designed to survive a flooded car deck. No ro-ro ferry is. Once the water gets in, it moves faster than any crew can respond. The general alarm sounded at 1:20, a piercing electronic wail that echoed through the corridors. But by then, many passengers were already awake, already aware that something was terribly wrong. The alarm told them nothing they did not already know. Some survivors say they never heard it at all. The public address system crackled to life. Alarm, alarm, there is a problem with the ship. In Estonian, then in English. The voice was calm, almost detached, as if reading a script, and then the PA cut out and the ship went dark. The main engines had shut down. Without lubrication, tilted beyond their operational angle, they simply stopped. The lights flickered and died. Emergency lighting came on, dim and yellow, but even that failed within minutes as the electrical systems flooded. Passengers were left in near total darkness, in a ship that was now tilted 40 degrees, 50 degrees, 60 degrees. Doors that had been vertical were now horizontal. Walls were floors. Floors were walls. Stairwells became shafts leading down into black water. Those who survived the sinking describe it in fragments. No one has a complete picture. Memory in moments of extreme trauma becomes unreliable. But the fragments, pieced together, form a mosaic of terror. A 19-year-old Swedish woman, Sarah Hedrenius, remembered her training as a volunteer firefighter. She followed exit signs that were now sideways, climbing hand over hand, encouraging others to follow her. She made it to the outer deck. Many who followed her did not. An Estonian woman, Jeanette Keld, was trapped in a cabin with her mother. Her mother could not move, could not climb. Jeanette made a choice that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She left her mother behind and climbed out. She survived. Her mother did not. Paul Anderson, a truck driver, smashed a window with a chair, creating an escape route for dozens of people. He survived. Many he helped also survived. But many more, unable to reach that window, did not. Celine Ots, an Estonian singer, grabbed life jackets and distributed them to passengers in a lounge before the ship tilted too far. She made it out through a broken window. Whether the life jackets she handed out saved anyone is unknown. Pierre Isaksson, the Swedish singer, was last heard singing. Some survivors say he was comforting people, singing to calm them as the ship went down. His body was never recovered. Urmas Alender, the Estonian rock musician, also perished. His voice, which had defined a generation, was silenced in the dark. The reactions on board ranged from sheer panic to eerie calm. Some passengers screamed, some prayed, some sat quietly, resigned as the water rose. Human nature, in extremis, is unpredictable. There were acts of selflessness and acts of desperation. People trampled each other in stairwells. People helped strangers climb to safety. People locked arms and waited together for the end. People clawed at walls alone. One group of off-duty crew reportedly prayed together when they realized their escape route was cut off. They were found later, still together, in a flooded corridor. Another group of passengers, according to survivor testimony, formed a human chain to help each other up a tilted hallway. Most of the chain did not make it out. The crew, those who survived, speak of chaos. No time for muster stations, no time for lifeboat drills, no time for anything but instinct. Some crew members tried to guide passengers. Others were swept away by the tilt, by the water, by the sheer impossibility of the situation. The lifeboats, in theory, could hold everyone on board. In practice, they were useless. The portside boats dangled in the air, unreachable. The starboard side boats were underwater. A few inflatable life rafts deployed automatically as the ship sank, triggered by water pressure. These rafts became the only real hope. By 1:30, the Estonia was on her side. The hull, visible now above the waterline, glistened wet in the darkness. Passengers who had made it to the outer deck found themselves walking on the side of the ship, clinging to railings, sliding toward the water. Some jumped, some were washed off by waves, some simply held on until the ship went under and took them with it. The Mayday call sent at 1:22 reached several nearby vessels. But the initial response was confusion. The officer on the Estonia's bridge had said, "Good morning, we have a problem." Not Mayday, not sinking, just a problem. The tone was so calm that the Mariella, a nearby ferry, assumed it was a pan-pan, an urgent situation, but not a distress. It took several minutes, several exchanges, before the Mariella understood that a ship was capsizing. By then, The Estonia was already past the point of rescue. The Mariella relayed the distress to the Finnish Maritime Rescue Coordination Center in Turku. The MRCC immediately launched a full-scale rescue operation. Helicopters were scrambled. Ships in the area were diverted, but the earliest a helicopter could arrive was 3 in the morning, and the Estonia sank at 1:50. That left over an hour of darkness, of storm, of freezing water, with no help coming. Survivors who made it into the water describe it as worse than the sinking. The ship, terrifying as it was, had at least been a structure, a place to hold on to. The water was chaos, waves 4 meters high, wind tearing at their faces, rain like needles, and the cold. The Baltic in late September is 10 degrees Celsius, cold enough to kill quickly. Hypothermia sets in within minutes. Consciousness fades within 20 minutes. Death follows soon after. Some survivors found life rafts. Others clung to debris. A few found the overturned bottom of a partially inflated raft and climbed on top. Dozens of people huddled together, shivering, praying, waiting for dawn. The rafts were designed to protect from the elements, but many were damaged, half inflated, swamped by waves. People fell off. People gave up. People simply closed their eyes and let the cold take them. Kent Herstedt, a young Swedish politician, survived by clinging to a raft for hours. He later wrote that he and others sang songs to stay awake, to keep each other conscious. When someone stopped singing, they were already gone. Lauri Sillanpää, a Finnish truck driver, pulled a young woman from the water into his life raft. Her name was Josephine. Her fiancé had drowned minutes earlier. Sillanpää and Josephine would meet regularly for years afterward, bound by that moment, by the fact that he had saved her, and she had survived. Margus and Neil, one a crew member, one a passenger, climbed a vertical railing together as the ship sank. They jumped clear just before the Estonia went under. They found the same raft. They survived together. Their names are recorded in survivor lists, but little else is known about them. They are ghosts in the archive, 2 among 137. Others were not so fortunate. Marja and Pekka Fagerholm, a Finnish couple, were washed out an open door by a wave as the ship capsized. They landed near a raft. They climbed on. They lived, but they speak of it as luck, not skill. A wave, a door, a raft, chance. The first helicopter arrived at 3:05 in the morning. A Finnish border guard helicopter, flown by pilots who had trained for search and rescue, but never for anything like this. The sea below was dark, littered with debris, life rafts scattered across miles of water. The pilots used searchlights, scanning the waves, looking for the orange glow of survival suits, the flashing lights of life rafts. But there were no survival suits. The passengers had nothing but their clothes, and many of those had been torn off by the water. The helicopters winched survivors up one by one, a slow, agonizing process. High winds made hovering difficult. Waves threatened to smash the rafts. Some survivors were too weak to grab the harness and had to be lifted by rescue swimmers who dropped into the water to secure them. The helicopter crews worked without pause, flying back to land, dropping off survivors, refueling, returning, over and over. 26 helicopters. 104 people saved directly by air. The ships, meanwhile, conducted surface searches. The Mariella rescued 16 survivors using its evacuation slide, directing rafts to come alongside. The Isabella saved others. The Silja Europa, the Burka Princess, the cargo ship. All of them searched. Searchlights swept the water. Flares were launched. Survivors waved flashlights, jackets, anything reflective. Some were found, many were not. By 7 in the morning, the official search was called off. Not because there was no hope hours earlier, but because by 7, anyone still in the water would have been dead from hypothermia. The sea had claimed them. The focus shifted from rescue to recovery. And recovery, in the end, yielded only 94 bodies. The rest, 758 people, remain inside the wreck or scattered on the sea floor. The Estonia lies at 80 meters depth, on her starboard side, her bow pointing northeast, her stern collapsed. Divers who have visited the wreck, legally or otherwise, describe it as a tomb. Corridors filled with silt, cabins where the dead still rest. The car deck, a graveyard of vehicles and cargo, everything encrusted with marine growth. The ship is deteriorating. Rust eats the hull. The structure weakens. One day, the Estonia will collapse entirely, scattering her contents across the seabed. In 1995, Estonia, Sweden, Finland, and other Baltic nations signed the Estonia Agreement. The wreck was declared a marine grave. It became illegal for citizens of signatory countries to disturb it. No salvage, no diving, no recovery of bodies. The decision was controversial. Families wanted their loved ones back. They wanted closure. But the governments argued that recovery was too dangerous, too expensive, and would disturb the dead. The treaty stands. The Estonia remains sealed. But the treaty did not stop everyone. In 1999, a German journalist named Jutta Rabe dove the wreck illegally. She claimed to have found evidence of an explosion, of a hole in the hull that was not caused by the visor failure. Her findings were disputed, dismissed by officials, but they fueled conspiracy theories. In 2020, a Swedish documentary used underwater ROVs to film a previously undocumented 4-meter hole in the starboard hull. The revelation prompted Sweden to reopen a limited investigation. The hole's origin remains unexplained. Was it caused by the sinking? By impact with the seabed? By something else? The official investigation in 1997 did not mention it. Either it was not there then, or it was not seen, or it was not deemed relevant. Now, decades later, it raises questions that may never be answered. The Estonia, even in death, refuses to give up all her secrets. The joint Estonian-Finnish-Swedish commission that investigated the sinking was formed within days of the disaster. 3 nations, each with its own interests, its own political pressures, its own grief. The Commission's mandate was clear: determine why the Estonia sank and make recommendations to prevent it from happening again. The final report, released in December 1997, ran to over 1,000 pages. Its conclusion was unambiguous. The bow visor locks failed due to storm stress. The visor tore off. The inner ramp door, not designed to withstand the sea on its own, bent and opened. Water flooded the car deck at a catastrophic rate. The ship capsized within 40 minutes. Design flaws, inadequate maintenance oversight, and severe weather combined into disaster. The report was thorough. It included metallurgical analysis of the visor locks, which showed metal fatigue and hairline cracks. It included testimony from survivors, from rescue personnel, from engineers who had worked on similar vessels. It included computer simulations of the flooding and capsize. The physics were clear. A large open car deck with no watertight subdivisions is inherently vulnerable. Once water enters, it shifts with the motion of the ship, creating what engineers call the free surface effect. This effect destabilizes the vessel, accelerating the list, making recovery impossible. The Estonia, once the car deck flooded, was doomed. The Commission also faulted the crew for delayed response. The banging noises from the bow should have been investigated immediately. The list should have triggered an earlier distress call. But the Commission acknowledged the chaos, the speed of the disaster, the fact that the crew had almost no time to react. Blame, in the end, was diffuse. The designers who under-engineered the visor, the classification society that certified the ship, the crew who did not recognize the danger quickly enough, the weather that pushed the ship beyond its limits. Everyone and no one. But not everyone accepted the report. Within months, alternative theories began to circulate. Some were wild. A collision with a submarine. A bomb planted by Russian intelligence. Secret military cargo that exploded. Others were more measured. Structural damage from a previous grounding. A collision with a container lost from another ship. The hole in the hull, later discovered, gave these theories new life. If the visor failure was the cause, why was there a hole in the hull? And if the hole was caused by impact with the seabed, why did it appear so cleanly cut, so unlike the ragged damage typically seen in shipwrecks? The Swedish government, under pressure from families and from journalists, reopened a limited investigation in 2020. The new inquiry focused specifically on the hull damage. Divers and ROVs were sent to the wreck to document the hull, to analyze its edges, to determine whether it was caused by the sinking or by something else. As of now, the results are inconclusive. The hole exists. Its origin is uncertain. The official cause of the sinking remains visor failure, but the door to doubt has been left slightly ajar. Conspiracy theories thrive in the absence of certainty, and the Estonia has uncertainty in abundance. The wreck is sealed. Full forensic examination is impossible. Bodies were never recovered, so autopsies were limited. The ship had no black box, no voyage data recorder, so much of what happened on the bridge in those final minutes is conjecture based on survivor testimony and the few instrument readings that were preserved. The treaty that declared the wreck a grave also made it a mystery. By forbidding access, it ensured that questions would remain unanswered. Some survivors find the conspiracy theories offensive. They were there. They know the ship capsized because it flooded. They do not need submarines or bombs to explain what they lived through. Others, however, are less certain. They remember the banging, the shudder, the way the ship listed so suddenly. Could it have been an explosion? Could there have been a collision? They do not know. And because they do not know, they keep asking. The official investigations led to concrete changes. Within a year of the disaster, new regulations were implemented across Europe. All ferries with bow visors were inspected. Many were retrofitted with secondary locking mechanisms, with wave deflectors, with reinforced hinges. Indicators were installed on bridges so that captains could monitor the bow door in real time. Some ferries had cameras added, pointing at the visor, so that any sign of failure could be seen immediately. The SOLAS Convention, the International Safety of Life at Sea Agreement, was amended. New damage stability requirements were introduced for ro-ro ferries. Ships had to demonstrate that they could survive a flooded car deck for a minimum period, long enough to evacuate. Some ferries added longitudinal bulkheads to subdivide the car deck, slowing the spread of water. Others installed drainage systems to pump water out faster than it could accumulate, though the effectiveness of such systems in extreme flooding is debatable. Voyage data recorders became mandatory on passenger ships. The maritime equivalent of black boxes, these devices record bridge conversations, instrument readings, radar data, everything that might be needed to reconstruct an accident. The Estonia had none of this. Future ships would. Crew training also changed. Drills for sudden loss of stability became standard. Evacuation procedures were revised. Muster stations were reconsidered for ships where rapid capsize was possible. The concept of safe return to port, the idea that a ship should be able to survive damage and limp back to harbour rather than sink, began to influence design philosophy. Not all of these changes were directly caused by the Estonia, but the Estonia accelerated them. It became the case study, the example that naval architects cited when arguing for stricter standards. The Stockholm Agreement, signed in 1996, specifically addressed ferry stability in the Baltic. It imposed additional requirements on ships operating in that region, beyond what SOLAS demanded. The Baltic, with its cold water and frequent storms, was recognized as particularly unforgiving. Ships operating there needed to be held to a higher standard. The Estonia's legacy, in regulatory terms, is a safer generation of ferries. How much safer is difficult to quantify. No identical disaster has occurred since. Whether that is due to the new regulations, to better weather forecasting, to improved crew training, or simply to luck, no one can say. The human legacy is harder to measure. 137 survivors, each of them forever marked by what they lived through. Some, like Kent Herstedt, wrote books, gave interviews, became public figures. Others retreated into privacy, unwilling or unable to speak about that night. Survivor guilt is common. Why did I live when so many others died? What did I do to deserve survival? These questions have no answers, but they haunt nonetheless. Sara Hedrenius, the young Swedish woman who used her firefighter training to escape, became an advocate for maritime safety. She testified before parliamentary committees, spoke at conferences, pushed for the changes that eventually came. Her survival gave her a platform. She used it. Mikko Herkin, the Finnish trucker who pulled 3 people from the water into a raft, watched 2 of them die beside him. He speaks rarely of the experience. When he does, his voice is flat, emotionless, as if describing someone else's memory. Trauma for some is a wall. For others, it is a well. Herkin built a wall. Jutta Rabe, the German journalist who survived and later dove the wreck illegally, spent years campaigning for the Estonia to be raised, for further investigation, for answers. She became obsessed. The sinking defined her life. Whether that obsession brought her peace or deepened her torment is unclear. She continues to write, to argue, to insist that the official story is incomplete. Perhaps she is right. Perhaps she is not. The sea keeps its secrets, and Rabe keeps hers. The survivors meet occasionally on anniversaries, fewer each year. Time, age, distance, all of them take their toll. They do not call themselves a club or an association. They are simply people who share a night that no one else can fully understand. They do not always agree. Some believe the official report, others do not. Some want the wreck raised. Others think it should remain a grave. But they are bound by survival, by the fact that they were there, in the water, in the rafts, in the dark, and they lived. The families of the dead have their own legacy. For many, the absence of a body made grief unbearable. How do you mourn someone who is still out there, somewhere, under the sea? How do you hold a funeral with an empty coffin? Some families held memorial services. Others could not. The Estonia Agreement, which sealed the wreck, was intended to give families peace, to designate the ship itself as a grave. But for some, it felt like abandonment. Their loved ones were left there, in the cold and the dark, and no one was allowed to bring them home. In Tallinn, the memorial is a broken arch, its gap symbolizing the lives severed. The names of the dead are inscribed on black granite, weathered now by Baltic wind and rain. On September 28th each year, flowers are placed at the base. Candles are lit. Speeches are given. Survivors attend when they can. Families attend when they can. The sea, visible from the memorial, is always there, calm or rough, indifferent. In Stockholm, the memorial is different. A granite walkway split in 2, the crack representing the rupture in so many lives. It sits in Djurgården, a park on the waterfront, a place where people jog, walk dogs, live their ordinary lives. The memorial is a reminder that disaster does not happen in a vacuum. It happens to ordinary people, in ordinary places, and the world continues around it. The cultural memory of the Estonia is strongest in Estonia itself. For a small nation, the loss was enormous. Almost everyone knew someone on the ship, or knew someone who knew someone. It became a national tragedy, spoken of in the same breath as wars and deportations. Songs were written, poems, paintings. The ship became a symbol, not just of loss, but of vulnerability, of the fragility of the new independence. Estonia had broken free from the Soviet Union only 3 years earlier. The sinking felt, to some, like a reminder that freedom comes with risk, that nothing is guaranteed, that the sea does not care about flags or nationalities. One song, Era kusi meri mu keist, became associated with the disaster. The title translates to "Don't Ask the Sea About Me." 6. The lyrics speak of the sea as a keeper of souls, a place where questions go unanswered. It was not written about the Estonia specifically, but it fit. The sea had taken 852 people, and it was not giving them back. In Sweden, the sinking is remembered differently. It is a tragedy, yes, but Sweden is a larger country, with a longer maritime history. The Estonia is one disaster among many. Still, for those who lost family, for the survivors, for the rescue personnel who worked that night, it is singular. It is the thing that divides their lives into before and after. The media coverage, intense in the immediate aftermath, faded over time. But every 5 years, on major anniversaries, it returns. Documentaries are produced. Newspaper articles are written. Survivors are interviewed again. The same questions are asked. The same answers are given or not given. The Estonia, like Titanic, like Lusitania, has become part of the cultural lexicon of disaster. It is shorthand for sudden catastrophe, for the failure of modernity, for the sea's indifference. And yet, for all the coverage, for all the memorials and the investigations and the regulations, there is a sense that the Estonia is slipping from memory. Younger generations do not remember it. They were not born yet, or they were too young. The ship is history now, not news. The survivors are aging. The families are aging. The rescue personnel are aging. In another 20 years, there may be no one left who remembers the night firsthand. The Estonia will be an archive, a case study, a memorial no one visits. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the mystery will keep it alive. The hole in the hull. The unanswered questions. The conspiracy theories that refuse to die. Mystery has a way of preserving memory. As long as people are asking what really happened, the Estonia will not fade. It will remain, suspended between history and speculation, between fact and folklore, between the official report and the nagging sense that something is missing. The investigations continue, in a limited way. The Swedish government, under pressure from new evidence, has committed to a fresh examination of the wreck. Advanced ROVs, 3D mapping, sonar surveys, all of the tools that did not exist in 1994 are now being deployed. What they will find is uncertain. The wreck is deteriorating. Rust and marine growth obscure details. The structure is weakening. Within a few more decades, the Estonia may collapse entirely, scattering its contents across the seabed, making further investigation impossible. The treaty that sealed the wreck is also under pressure. Some families, some survivors, some journalists argue that it should be dissolved, that the wreck should be accessible for full forensic examination. Others argue the opposite, that the dead should be left in peace, that further disturbance is disrespectful. The debate is unlikely to be resolved. The treaty, signed by multiple nations, is difficult to overturn, and even if it were, the cost of a full investigation, of raising the ship or conducting extensive underwater archaeology, would be enormous. Who would pay? And for what? To confirm what is already known? Or to discover something new, something that might rewrite the story entirely? The Estonia is a ship, a wreck, a grave, a mystery, a symbol, a case study, a memory. It is all of these things at once, and none of them fully. It exists in multiple states, like a quantum particle, observed differently depending on who is looking and why. For the survivors, it is trauma. For the families, it is loss. For engineers, it is a lesson. For conspiracy theorists, it is a cover-up. For historians, it is a turning point. For the sea, it is just another wreck. One of thousands, slowly being reclaimed by salt and time. The survivors of the Estonia did not return to ordinary life. How could they? They had spent hours in freezing water, clinging to life rafts, watching others slip away into the dark. They had climbed out of a sinking ship while hundreds remained trapped inside. They had been winched into helicopters, wrapped in blankets, flown to hospitals where doctors treated them for hypothermia and shock and injuries that would heal, while the psychological wounds remained open. Kent Herstedt wrote a book, And the Sea Will Tell. In it, he described the hours in the water, the way he and others sang songs to stay conscious, to keep each other awake. He described the cold, not as a sensation, but as an entity, something that crept into the body and demanded surrender. He described watching people give up, watching them close their eyes and let go, sinking beneath the waves without a struggle. He described the guilt of surviving, the irrational but persistent belief that he had taken someone else's place, that his life was borrowed from the dead. Sarah Hadrenius spoke publicly, often. Her account of climbing through the tilted corridors, of following exit signs that were now sideways, of breaking through to the outer deck and jumping into the sea, it became one of the most widely known survivor stories. She was articulate, composed, able to describe the horror without breaking down. This made her valuable to journalists, to documentary makers, to parliamentary committees investigating the disaster. But composure has a cost. She spoke of nightmares, of waking in the dark, certain that she was still in the water, still waiting for rescue that might never come. Mikko Herkin, the Finnish trucker, pulled 3 people from the water into his life raft. 2 of them died beside him. He felt their bodies go rigid, felt the warmth leave them, felt the moment when they stopped being people and became weight. He does not speak of this often. When asked, he describes it in clinical terms, as if it happened to someone else. Dissociation, psychologists call it. A way of surviving the memory by keeping it at a distance. Jutta Rabe, the German journalist, survived the sinking and then spent years trying to prove that the official explanation was incomplete. She dove the wreck illegally. She interviewed other survivors, other experts, other conspiracy theorists. She wrote articles, produced documentaries, testified at hearings. For her, the Estonia became an obsession, a puzzle that demanded solving. Whether this obsession gave her purpose or consumed her is difficult to say. Perhaps both. The survivors formed what some called an unwilling fraternity. They met on anniversaries, at memorials, at hearings. Some became friends. Others remained distant, connected only by shared trauma. They did not always agree. Some believed the official report. Others thought it was a cover-up. Some wanted the wreck raised, wanted their questions answered, wanted closure. Others wanted the dead left in peace, wanted the ship to remain a grave, wanted the past to stay in the past. But all of them, regardless of their beliefs, carried the weight of survival. Why them? Why not the person in the next cabin, the person who drowned a meter away, the person who let go just before the helicopter arrived? Survivor guilt is not rational. It does not respond to logic or statistics. It simply exists, a constant low hum beneath the surface of daily life. Some survivors struggled with post-traumatic stress, flashbacks, panic attacks, an inability to be near water, to board ships, to sleep through the night without waking in terror. Others seemed, on the surface, to recover. They returned to work, to families, to routines. But those close to them often noticed changes, a withdrawal, a sadness, a sense that part of them was still out there, in the cold, in the dark, waiting. Maria and Pekka Fagerholm, the Finnish couple who were washed out of the ship by a wave, spoke rarely of their experience. When they did, they credited luck, nothing more. A wave, a door, a raft. They did not feel heroic. They did not feel chosen. They felt simply fortunate in a way that made no sense and brought no comfort. Captain Uno Lauer, a passenger who had survived another sinking as a child during World War II, lamented the lack of organization, the absence of clear orders, the chaos that had defined the evacuation. He had expected better. He had survived one sinking because of discipline, because of training, because the crew had maintained order. The Estonia, by contrast, had been every person for themselves. He did not blame the crew. He understood the impossible circumstances, but he mourned the loss of what he called maritime discipline. The idea that even in disaster, there should be structure, leadership, a plan. The families of the dead faced a different kind of torment. Most had no bodies to bury. The Estonia Agreement, which sealed the wreck, meant that their loved ones would remain underwater, inside the ship, forever. For some, this was unbearable. They wanted recovery, wanted funerals, wanted closure. They lobbied governments, filed lawsuits, campaigned for the treaty to be dissolved. But the treaty held. The wreck remained sealed. Others found a measure of peace in the idea that the ship itself was a grave. Their loved ones were not scattered, not lost, but resting in a specific place together. The memorials in Tallinn and Stockholm became surrogate grave sites. Families visited, left flowers, spoke to the sea as if it could carry their words down to the dead. One woman, whose husband had died in the sinking, visited the Stockholm Memorial every week for 10 years. She brought flowers, always the same kind, always fresh. She spoke to him, told him about their children, about her life, about the world he was missing. Eventually, she stopped coming. Not because she had forgotten, but because she had run out of things to say. Grief, for her, had become routine, and routine had worn it smooth. The Estonia's impact on shipbuilding and safety regulations was immediate and substantial. Within months, ferry operators across Europe began modifying their vessels. Bow visors were reinforced. Secondary locking mechanisms were installed. Wave deflectors were added to reduce the force of water hitting the visor. Monitoring systems were upgraded so that bridge crews could see, in real time, the status of the bow door. The Solis Convention was amended to require voyage data recorders on all passenger ships over 3,000 gross tons. These devices, often called black boxes, record everything. Bridge conversations, instrument readings, radar data, engine performance. If a ship sinks, the recorder, designed to survive impact and immersion, can be recovered and analyzed. The Estonia had no such device. Everything had to be reconstructed from survivor testimony, from scattered instrument readings, from the wreck itself. Future ships would not have this problem. Damage stability requirements were also revised. Ro-ro ferries, with their large open car decks, were recognized as inherently vulnerable to flooding. New regulations required that such ships be able to survive a certain amount of flooding, long enough to evacuate passengers and crew. Some ferries were retrofitted with longitudinal bulkheads, dividing the car deck into sections to slow the spread of water. Others installed pumping systems designed to remove water faster than it could accumulate, though the effectiveness of such systems in catastrophic flooding remains debatable. The concept of safe return to port began to influence cruise ship design. The idea was simple. A ship should be able to survive significant damage and limp back to harbor under its own power, rather than sinking. This concept, while not directly applicable to the Estonia, was influenced by the disaster. Naval architects began designing ships with redundant systems, with watertight compartments, with emergency power supplies that could keep the ship afloat and operational even after a hull breach. Ferry operations also changed. Loading procedures were scrutinized. Crew training was overhauled. Drills for sudden loss of stability became mandatory. Muster stations were reconsidered for scenarios where rapid capsize was possible. The idea that a ferry could sink in 40 minutes, with almost no time to evacuate, was no longer theoretical. It had happened, and it could not be allowed to happen again. The Stockholm Agreement of 1996 imposed additional stability requirements on ferries operating in the Baltic. The agreement recognized that the Baltic, with its cold water and frequent storms, was particularly dangerous. Ships operating there needed to meet higher standards than those operating in calmer, warmer seas. The agreement was controversial. Ferry operators complained about the cost of compliance, but the political will, in the wake of the Estonia, was overwhelming. The regulations passed. Whether these changes made ferries significantly safer is difficult to prove. No disaster identical to the Estonia has occurred since. But correlation is not causation. The absence of a similar disaster could be due to the new regulations, or to better weather forecasting, or to improved crew training, or simply to luck. What is certain is that the Estonia changed the conversation. Ferry safety, once taken for granted, became a subject of intense scrutiny. And that scrutiny, at a minimum, made it harder for unsafe practices to persist. The public memory of the Estonia is strongest in Estonia and Sweden. In Estonia, the disaster is woven into the national narrative. The ship was a symbol of the newly independent nation, and its loss felt like a national wound. Almost everyone in Estonia knows someone who was on the ship, or knows someone who knew someone. The memorial in Tallinn is visited regularly, not just on anniversaries, but throughout the year. It is a place of pilgrimage, of mourning, of remembrance. In Sweden, the memory is quieter, but no less profound. The sinking is remembered as one of the worst peacetime maritime disasters in Swedish history. Memorials are held on September 28th each year. Survivors and families gather. Speeches are given. Flowers are laid. The sea, always visible, always present, is acknowledged as both adversary and resting place. In Finland, fewer people died, but the rescue effort left a lasting impact. The helicopter pilots and rescue personnel who worked that night are still recognized, still honored. The coordination between Finland and Sweden during the rescue is cited as a model of international cooperation. But the memory is also tinged with frustration, with the knowledge that, despite the heroic efforts, most of those on the Estonia were beyond saving by the time help arrived. Culturally, the Estonia has inspired art, music, literature. Songs have been written, some mournful, some accusatory. Paintings have been created, depicting the ship, the sea, the life rafts. Books have been published, both memoirs by survivors and investigative works by journalists. Documentaries have been produced, some focusing on the human stories, others on the technical failure, still others on the conspiracy theories. One Estonian song, Era Kusi, Merimu Keest, became synonymous with the disaster. The lyrics, which translate to "Don't ask the sea about me," speak of the sea as a place where answers go to die, where questions remain unanswered. The song was not written about the Estonia, but it fit. The sea had taken 852 people and given nothing back. The Estonia has also entered popular consciousness in a way that transcends the Baltic region. It is sometimes called the Baltic's Titanic, a comparison that is both apt and misleading. Like the Titanic, the Estonia was considered safe, modern, unsinkable by the standards of her time. Like the Titanic, she sank quickly, catastrophically, taking most of her passengers with her. But unlike the Titanic, the Estonia has not become a global symbol. She remains regional, a tragedy known intimately in some places, and hardly at all in others. Modern rediscoveries have kept the Estonia in the news. In 2020, a Swedish documentary revealed a previously undocumented 4-meter hole in the starboard hull of the wreck. The hole was clean-edged, not ragged like impact damage typically is. Its origin remains unexplained. The official investigation in 1997 did not mention it. Either it was not there at the time, or it was not seen, or it was deemed irrelevant. The discovery prompted Sweden to reopen a limited investigation. New surveys of the wreck were authorized. Advanced ROVs and 3D mapping technology were deployed. The goal was to document the hole, to analyze its edges, to determine whether it could have been caused by the sinking itself or by something else. As of now, the results are inconclusive. The hole exists. Its cause is uncertain. The official explanation for the sinking, bow visor failure leading to catastrophic flooding, remains unchanged. But the hole introduces doubt, and doubt, once introduced, is difficult to remove. Earlier, in 1999, German journalist Jutta Rabe had dove the wreck illegally in violation of the Estonia Agreement. She claimed to have found evidence of an explosion, of damage inconsistent with the official story. Her findings were disputed, dismissed by officials as inconclusive or misinterpreted. But they fueled conspiracy theories, kept the debate alive, ensured that the Estonia would not fade quietly into history. Conspiracy theories around the Estonia range from the plausible to the absurd. Some suggest the ship was carrying secret military cargo, that an explosion occurred, that governments covered it up to avoid international incident. Others claim the ship collided with a submarine, Swedish or Russian, and that both nations agreed to blame the visor failure to avoid political fallout. Still others suggest sabotage, though by whom and for what purpose remains unclear. Most survivors reject these theories. They were there. They felt the ship list. They saw the water flood in. They do not need explosions or submarines to explain what they lived through. But some are less certain. They remember the banging, the sudden lurch, the way the ship capsized so quickly. Could there have been more than visor failure? They do not know. And because they do not know, the questions persist. The Estonia Agreement, which declared the wreck a marine grave, was intended to provide closure. By sealing the site, by making it illegal to disturb, the agreement was meant to respect the dead, to give families a place to mourn, to end the debate. But it had the opposite effect. By forbidding access, it ensured that full forensic examination would never be possible. It turned the wreck into a mystery, a locked room that can never be opened, a question that can never be fully answered. Some argue the treaty should be dissolved, that the wreck should be raised or at least made accessible for thorough investigation. Others argue that the dead should be left in peace, that further disturbance is disrespectful, that the answers, even if found, would change nothing. The debate is unlikely to be resolved. The treaty, signed by multiple nations, is difficult to overturn. And even if it were, the cost of raising the Estonia, or conducting extensive underwater archaeology, would be enormous. Tens of millions, perhaps hundreds of millions. Who would pay? And for what? To confirm what is already known, or to discover something that might rewrite history? The wreck itself is deteriorating. 80 meters down, lying on its starboard side, the Estonia is slowly being consumed by the sea. Rust eats the hull. Marine organisms colonize the surfaces. The structure weakens. In another few decades, the ship may collapse entirely, scattering its contents across the seabed, making further investigation impossible. The sea is patient. It does not rush, but it always wins. The legacy of the Estonia is multi-layered. On one level, it is a tragedy, a disaster that took 852 lives and scarred thousands more. On another level, it is a catalyst, a turning point in maritime safety that led to regulations and design changes that have likely saved lives since. On yet another level, it is a mystery, a story with gaps and contradictions, with official explanations that satisfy some but not all, with questions that remain unanswered. For the survivors, the legacy is personal. It is the memory of a night that divided their lives into before and after. It is the weight of survival, the guilt, the nightmares, the knowledge that they lived when so many others did not. For the families, the legacy is loss, a wound that never fully heals, a grave that is both specific and unreachable. For the nations involved, the legacy is complex. Estonia lost 1 person per 1,000 of its population. Sweden lost hundreds of citizens. Finland lost fewer, but bore the burden of the rescue. The disaster brought these nations together in shared mourning, in cooperation, in a commitment to ensure it would not happen again. But it also left scars, political and emotional, that persist. The Estonia will never be forgotten in the Baltic region. The memorials ensure that. The anniversaries ensure that. The survivors, as long as they live, ensure that. But memory fades. Younger generations do not remember the sinking. They were not born yet. They do not feel the weight of it. For them, the Estonia is history, not memory. A story, not a lived experience. In maritime circles, the Estonia is taught as a case study. Naval architects study the bow visor failure. Engineers analyze the flooding dynamics. Coast Guards train for scenarios based on the disaster. The lessons are embedded in regulations, in design standards, in emergency protocols. The Estonia, in this sense, lives on. Not as a ship, but as a warning. The epitaph on one of the memorials reads, "Me pelgus vastu," the sea against fear. A poetic acknowledgement that the sea is indifferent, that it will take what it wants, but that we confront it nonetheless. We build ships, we cross oceans, we take risks, and sometimes we pay the price. The Estonia was a floating palace. She was a symbol of independence, of modernity, of connection. She was 509 feet of steel and ambition. She had 400 cabins, multiple restaurants, a ballroom, a sauna, a casino. She carried 989 people on her final voyage. She sank in 40 minutes. 852 died. 137 survived. These are the facts, the numbers, the timeline. But numbers do not capture the terror, the cold, the darkness. They do not capture the moment when the lights went out, when the ship tilted past the point of recovery, when passengers realized they were going to die. They do not capture the choice Jeanette Keld made to leave her mother and save herself. They do not capture the sound of Pierre Isaacson singing as the ship went down. They do not capture the hours in the water, the hypothermia, the helicopters, the dawn that came too late for most. The Estonia is a story told in fragments. Survivor testimony, official reports, conspiracy theories, memorials, regulations, a hole in the hull, a sealed wreck, a mystery that refuses to close. The sea keeps its secrets, and the Estonia, resting at 80 meters, keeps hers. Rest in peace. We learned from your fate. Or at least, we tried.